hoping that she would persuade them why cat videos are important tools of entertainment and relaxation. However, instead of talking about cats again, Cate is going to plead her case for why Congress should restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Even though the 2016 presidential race is mostly fodder for late-night comedy shows, and D's Nuts is an officially registered candidate for president, Cate will explain why voting is truly fundamental to our democracy and something we should take seriously. Her objectives are to persuade listeners to adopt her viewpoint or ideas or to take action, appeal to the listener's interest, use logic and emotion to support her position, and avoid using notes. Her time is 5 to 7 minutes. Please welcome Cate.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and guests, this month our nation celebrated the 50th anniversary of passing the Civil Rights Act. It was signed into law, the Voting Rights Act. Thank you, Julio, you're already making your noise. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Johnson on August 6, 1965, and it's been called the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever enacted. It was passed after a series of very violent civil rights marches from Selma, Alabama to the state's capital in Montgomery, including the march known as Bloody Sunday. Some of you may have seen the film Selma, which is a dramatic story of how the Voting Rights Act was passed. The Voting Rights Act was passed to give some strong enforcement tools to our federal government to enforce the 15th Amendment. You may recall the 15th Amendment was passed shortly after the Civil War, and it prohibits federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on the citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, those enforcement mechanisms got results. From 1965 to 1985, the number of black registered voters went from 31% to 73%. The number of black elected officials nationwide went from 500 to 10,000 plus. The number of black members of Congress went from 5 to 44. So the Voting Rights Act really became a tool that was able to combat discrimination even more than the school desegregation case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Why has it been so effective? Well, it did some obvious things like outlawing poll taxes and literacy tests, but the real teeth included a special pre-clearance or precondition requirement for certain jurisdictions. And that fell initially on 6 southern states, and that was later expanded to 9. And the way that works is it puts the burden on those states anytime they're changing laws relating to voting to get pre-clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice. So under the traditional legal standard for showing discriminatory practices under our Constitution, the test or the challenger must show both discriminatory effect, which is a disproportionate impact on minorities, and also discriminatory intent. That's really difficult to show, that the legislature, when they passed the law, intended for it to result in discrimination. It's a very difficult standard. So the Voting Rights Act changed that standard, put the burden of proof on the state in enacting the law. So if the effect of change in voting requirements was to diminish the voting power of minorities, it didn't matter what the sponsors intended. Couldn't happen. Now today, 2015, the Voting Rights Act is still technically the law, but its effectiveness has been greatly undermined by a 2013 Supreme Court case called Shelby versus Holder. This case struck down the rules that were originally enacted by Congress that were relating to the preclearance requirement. The decision allows Congress to enact new rules based on the current conditions. However, it's all but been politically impossible for Congress to pass new rules enforcing the Voting Rights Act. So what followed after the Supreme Court decision in Shelby versus Holder was that legislatures in many southern states took it upon themselves, where Republicans had political control, unfortunately, to make it harder for African Americans, Latinos, and for young people to vote. Now, of course, that's not what they said they were doing. They invented a decoy called voter fraud. This voter fraud was used as a reason or justification for very stringent voter ID laws. You have to show up with a driver's license or birth certificate. These laws operate to disadvantage inner-city residents in favor of suburbanites who get driver's licenses as a matter of routine. These same legislatures used all kinds of excuses to roll back early voting and Sunday voting, which have a greatly disproportionate effect on minorities and young people. Despite enormous evidence showing that voter fraud was a non-existent problem, this justification will not die. It has been used to create a massive new problem, second-generation obstruction to voter participation. Because of the Shelby case, Supreme Court case from 2013, the burden of proof is now on challengers to show not just discriminatory effect, but discriminatory intent, which is often difficult to show. Regardless of your politics, whether you are Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whether or not you support the current president, the point of the Voting Rights Act is to secure to all an equal voice as citizens, regardless of race. As Martin Luther King said so eloquently, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The Voting Rights Act was one of the monumental steps forward for our democracy in the 20th century. Congress should stand together to make it easier and not harder for more Americans to vote. Mr. President.